Good
Hey,
morning
Mark.
and good afternoon.
Afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you happen to be. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for joining us and spending your precious time. Brett Schuhart and I are going to share our experience from the past, well, not past, but a 10-week project that we completed that hopefully we can show all the energy that we had. Startups can be very interesting, and that's pretty much what we were working on. So, Brett, can you give us an overview of the project we just were working on?
Sure. Just a really quick background. We had an entrepreneur approach Industrial Logic, and he came with a pretty good comprehensive idea and some details in a part where he was worried about, can he do this? Does he have the budget, the technical expertise, and so on? So he came to us. We read over his initial proposal, and the one thing I'd say is, at the end of going through the documentation he provided for us, to me, I had a pretty clear idea of where he was trying to go. No idea how to do a lot of it, but I had a pretty clear idea. And, looking back, we ended up going where he was thinking we needed to go. So he came with us. He came to us with, a bunch of JIRA tasks and so on, and an idea, but also about 8 or 9 things. He was like, can we do this? Can we do this in a certain amount of time? Can I afford to do it? Because he didn't have much of a budget. So that was kind of the impetus. He thinks he has something that'll break into an existing domain that's relatively mature with a product that is going to be a combination of features from different products and streamlined so that it doesn't have a bunch of fluff. Because in the industry, there are a number of providers who have free software or inexpensive software, but because they're selling hardware as opposed to selling the software. So that's kind of the idea. And the general domain is initially installing or upgrading security systems in commercial buildings.
And so we're working in a domain, a new domain to us. And we'll talk about this hopefully later. We're also working with some visual stuff that we had not worked in years. We got to use our geometry muscles from going way back. And here at Industrial Logic, we really have a lot of practices that we feel makes us work faster. And here's an extreme case. Startups are an extreme case where the trade-offs are real every day, every minute of like getting features into users' hands, getting feedback. And even though, some of these techniques might seem to be more time, we still felt that they made us faster. And so as we talk through each of these practices that we used and highlight some of them, we love to hear your comments, questions. Please, ask questions as we go along. We'll try to incorporate them as much as possible. If we don't, we're happy to answer them at the end and over the next couple of days.
Well, Mark, let me ask you a question, because we've talked about a little bit about this, but what are some things that surprised you sort of, coming into this project?
I think the biggest surprise as I look back over the project is when I first started it and I saw the list of things that the client wanted to accomplish in a 10-week period. My initial reaction was, no way we're going to get through all that. These are things I've never done before. I don't know how this is going to happen. And I really was surprised at the end how much we did get done. It really is a testament of work on something small, get it working, go to the next small thing. And instead of getting overwhelmed by the big list of items or trying to design everything up front, it was, what's the most important thing? What is the smallest thing we can do today? And we would get it done in generally a day and move on. And while we're talking about daily stuff, one of the things that we embraced in this project were daily demos.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right, do you want to kind of describe that a little bit?
Yeah, so just the idea of this, we've been doing this at Industrial Logic. It's part of our ways of working for a couple of years at least. But we had a situation on multiple projects where our stakeholders just weren't available. And the idea of waiting to the end of a sprint or waiting till sometime in the future just really feels, anytime you can speed up feedback, it's going to have surprisingly good multiplier effects. And so we just started recording daily demos of the work we were doing. And for this project, that's what we did. It was, we started on a Monday. You and I kicked it off on a Monday, and then by Wednesday we had our first demo. Now, the demo was trivial. It was, we could upload an image, which ultimately becomes uploading a blueprint for where you lay out devices. But we were able to upload the image, we had it in production running on Amplify with the build process, a trivial, we had a build script, we had a test and so on, and also it worked in mobile, blah, blah, blah. So we had a bunch of, we had a desire to be able to show something the user could experience. That's part of the demo. We had pull to have something we could demonstrate. And then you and I are both big on things like, DevOps and all that kind of stuff. So the build pipeline was pulled along with the desire to have the demo. So we could have just thrown something live on Amplify, but we said, nope, we're going to have GitHub actions. It's going to even report failures to Slack, blah, blah, blah. And that, it took us a half day to put all that together. And of course we modified it over time, but we had, our first demo was actually quite a bit bigger in terms of the underlying hidden stuff that was done as well as the live stuff. And then, as you know, we did demos. We averaged a demo 3 demos a week over the 10-week period, right?
Yes. And I think there's two things that jump out to me about the demos. The first one is that by putting that video out there, you're making yourself very vulnerable, but it almost forces a conversation with other people. It opens up the possibility for a conversation. So you can use Slack, you can just use your recorder on your laptop, and we would just post that in Slack and wait for responses. So it became, the product owner, when he had some time, could take a look, or anyone else on the team can watch the video and give feedback. And it just opened up the vulnerability of having a conversation. The other thing is, I think, how it affected the way we worked, right? I remember a number of times, I think it was mostly you, Brad, but between the two of us, we would be like, well, did we do something today that actually affects the user? Is there something we did today that would produce a demo? And I think thinking in those terms gets you thinking more in the sense of, am I constantly delivering value? It's so easy to get stuck in not stuck, but like get focused in refactoring or focus on that infrastructure stuff. Oh, we might need this. And I think it changes the conversation to, do we need it? Because is it going to be noticeable to the user? You think about customer value more often, I think, when you do this practice.
I completely agree. And I can think of a number, especially early on, where we were like, okay, we need to do this and this and this and this. But we asked the question, okay, yeah, but how can anyone, how is our client going to know that we did anything, right? And so I would say part of that, though, was our client came in, he's been in the business for 10 years, both as a product owner and actually as a user of different systems. And so he was a legitimate, really excellent product owner, and he knew what was important to him and so on. And so having that kind of clarity really helped as well. But again, it was like, we know we have these X number of things we need to be able to do. And if we're not working on one of those, we better make sure that what we're doing is going to be really quick. Right. Yeah, absolutely.
It's
go ahead.
Maximizing the work, right? Getting as much done we can to deliver value in a short period of time.
Yeah.
So one of the other practices, I think about how, everyone talks about, do I need to follow all these practices, or do I need to do this? And I think about how the impacts of doing one thing can affect other things. So another thing that we did was very small commits.
Yep. Yeah.
Right? We did, we averaged about 20 commits.
22 per day. And just, mathematically about 35 commits per demo. Just, those numbers are kind of like, they sound precise, but they're kind of also irrelevant. Other than, I would say, for us, every commit would go through the build process. The build process initially didn't have a lot of tests, but it had tests, and it did TypeScript linting and what automated tests we have, and then it would go into production. And so, I don't know the total number of successful pushes, but I would say it was in the high 90s. When we were doing infrastructure, the GitHub stuff, we had, we'd have 5 or 6 failures in a row, but that was fine because we weren't hurting anything in production. But for the most part, 99% of our commits were successful. So, we probably had 21 commits to production live a day, but that doesn't necessarily mean all those commits had enough behavior that warranted a whole demo, right?
Correct. But by going to those small commits, or having that ability, right? Not only having unit tests in place, so if we did have a bad commit, that it wouldn't make it to production, it wouldn't break production, right? You said like the 90%. Well, it's like, we didn't break production, I don't know, maybe once during that time, if at all, because most of the time the tests would catch it. or
Yeah,
part,
yeah, I
or
can.
the
There,
deployment pipeline would fail, and so we would all would be good, right?
I think there was, yeah, there was one time when we did sort of mess up production. It wasn't fully messed up, but we did partially break one feature that I can remember. And then there was another time where we did. So for the most part, everything was trunk based. But because we were worried about uh, breaking production, there was one day where we had a trunk. We had one trunk, or maybe, or sorry, one branch, or maybe two branches that lasted under 24 hours each. Like we would start it, keep it, and then when we were happy, we'd merge it back in. Even though we were the only people committing, we wanted to keep production live, and we could have done, and we occasionally would do things where, like very lightweight feature toggles to have things either or parallel change, so we'd have two implementations of a cable run. But for the most part, we kept production live, we kept production working, and the one or two times we did mess it up, we remedied that and didn't do it again.
Well, the
Right.
thing is that we also could move quickly to fix it because
Yeah. Yep.
we had used those muscles. We had repeatedly done small commits, so we were used to doing a quick commit. Our build pipeline was fast to allow that feedback, and we
Yep.
could fix them super fast too. So like mistakes are going to happen, but the key is how quickly can you get back on a good spot.
Yeah. How quickly can you find out, and how quickly exactly? And it's all about fast feedback. So actually, one of the approach that we generally take is optimistic as opposed to pessimistic, right? We're optimistically pushing the trunk, and we're able to revert back, because I don't know about you, but two of my favorite Git commands are git checkout dot or reset head hard, whatever, and also just git revert. So I can tell you how many. Do you have a sense how many times do we have a false start and it's like, oh, this is terrible. Check out dot and just do it over. We would do that a couple times a week, right?
I think that was especially useful with new technologies as we started
Mm-hmm.
to get into like the graphics stuff. Hey, let's try this tool, or let's try this method. Oh, no, that didn't work. And I think we were more likely to do that than an actual revert because of the tests we had and because we ran our unit tests locally
Yeah.
before we would go. And even I love that the words you use, like more of an optimistic approach. Even in
Mm-hmm.
the cases that one case where there was a small issue in production, we were like, how do we fix it? Can we fix it quickly is the first question. And if we didn't, we could revert. But in general,
Right.
we're always looking to go forward, not go back when possible.
And I
And
haven't done the math, but if you think about it, if we do 22 commits a day, an average commit is less than a half hour in terms of time. And we were committing more than every half hour. So if you did a revert, you lost how much time? You lost almost nothing.
by
Yeah.
doing those small commits, I think it puts you in this mindset of constantly wanting to experiment, right? You feel less pain by doing that checkout and losing what you had if you only lost the past 10 minutes.
Right. Right.
So
Yes. And yeah.
and it also encourages better code because, hey, let's spend 10 minutes on refactoring this. And your brain gets into this natural rhythm of, hey, it's been a while, because we were so used to committing just every 10 minutes. We were able to just teach our brains, hey, when you got to like a half an hour, hey, it's been a while since we committed. What's going
Yeah.
on here, right? And then it forced us at times to go think smaller. How do we think smaller? How do we get smaller?
Yeah. And I can remember a number of times where, you or I are on the keyboard too long. We have something, especially when we're doing parallel change, or this is not going to break anything. It doesn't necessarily quote advance anything, but we want a different hands on the keyboard. And I don't, we had this conversation a number of times, that the amount of time where, like, when I'm on the keyboard, my focus is entirely different than when I'm not on the keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm navigating I'm seeing something entirely different. And it seemed to me your experience was exactly the same, right? It's like your focus changes completely when you're navigating versus the driver.
Absolutely. And why don't we get into that a little bit? We've kind of been talking around that a little bit. How did we work? We worked in a pair. There was just the two of us. And what did we say? We think about like 90% of the time we did the work as a pair, maybe 10% of the time was other stuff. But I think about how that changes the work significantly. One, it feels like a lifting partner. That's one of the ways I describe it. There are some days when you might be a little less motivated to work, but you're like, hey, my buddy he's going to show up at 9 o'clock. I better show up and be ready to go. And there might have been a couple of days where both of us were like, we were honest with each other about our feelings of like, hey,
Yeah.
today's like
Yeah.
life happened last night. And
Right.
we would follow our collective energy. We always were moving forward. We were always doing something. We didn't have a day where we were like, didn't get much done because we could help motivate each other. Now, the downside of that is because there's only two of us, it can be really
Yeah.
tiring. So
Yeah.
that's why mobbing can be a little bit better. So go ahead.
The one that was the one stressor because to your point, and you said this earlier, if I look at the list of features at the beginning, early on, our client wanted us to sort of estimate and come up with a preliminary architecture, but he was very open to lean thinking, which was awesome. So we didn't do any estimating for the most part. We didn't do a preliminary architecture, but you and I had both worked on systems that were React Native, AWS Lambdas, blah blah blah. So it's not like there's a lot of mystery or surprise there. So we really didn't need an architecture. But I certainly like I can think of the one feature, the blocking of the camera views. I had no idea how we were going to do that, and it took us a half hour because it was all supported by the library. But there were some other things like just getting the 2D canvas on there. So if you look at our statistics, our third or fourth demo was 4 business days after our previous one because we introduced Skia, and that all of a sudden threw a whole bunch of stuff up in the air in terms of how do we get this to work in web and mobile, blah blah blah. But while there were a number of problems, and yeah, it did take us 4 days, and that wasn't a comfortable 4 days taking that time. The number of things we did and learned was just huge. But also, we were, and you were better at this than I was, but we both would collect things that we could do for solo work because there were some things that did not require pairs, like formatting, introducing semantic components in your view to separate data from semantics from processing and all that kind of stuff. A lot of the stuff were automatic refactorings and so on, but for the most part, we worked together. And there were a number of times where, like in the morning, I'm like tired and you had energy, or vice versa, and then it flipped through the day. So there were some days where we didn't flip every 20 minutes or every half hour. We flipped less frequently, but we were both able to. We kept engaged, or if we didn't keep engaged, we take breaks, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that might have been one of the hardest things is set timers, use timers to remind yourself to take a break, and then also use that timer to come back at the same time. So, the project had so much energy and had so much interest. There were times that maybe we worked a little bit more than 8 hours a day on solo time, or I feel like based on our energy, there was never a need to work long hours. Everyone thinks startup, oh, you must have been working crazy, you work on the weekends. I don't, we never paired on the weekends. We never paired in off hour times. We might do a little solo work, but it always, whenever I was doing solo work, I would ask the question, is this low risk enough that I feel comfortable committing this myself? Is this just a make the screen look a little bit nicer? Is it this small refactoring? If it was bigger, the first thing we did in the morning the next day was share it with the other person to review it, to make sure we were on the same page. And sometimes we would actually then we would often allow the other person then to refactor that or to add to that if it was complex, right?
Yeah, that's actually a practice Cody and I started doing a couple projects back because we were doing trunk based and we wanted to do ping pong. And so we ended up doing a version of trunk based ping pong where I would actually write a test and get it working. And then Cody would do some refactoring. Then he would write a test, get it working, and hand off. And we did some of that as well, right? Or get halfway through something. Again, things are working but not complete, and then the next person would pick it up. But yeah, the only time there I would not do overtime out of obligation. I was doing it out of interest and enjoyment because it was some of the stuff was really actually fun. I mean, it was just. But the thing is, I don't know about you, but I couldn't have worked overtime because pairing is intense. My brain was generally fried by the end of the day, and not in a bad way, but I was like, most of my solo work, I would be sitting in a lounge chair watching reality TV with my wife and doing little things here and there. So it wasn't. I would generally not do anything terribly mentally complex or that wasn't supported by tests. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I
Yeah,
think, the practices that we follow, TDD and refactoring and constantly focusing on quality takes
yeah.
a high deal of discipline. And when you work by yourself, letting that discipline slide is a little bit easier. I feel like in a pair and a mob, not only do you catch each other, but you also then lean on those people to add that energy to keep that discipline.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm gonna be. It's gonna feel a bit odd, but I think it's worth mentioning that part of the reason we were able to do that was we did a couple things. One, so at the beginning we did a story map, and that story map actually covered the entire 10 weeks in not great detail, but generally good enough detail. We did update it a little bit, but I'd say the story map that we finished was probably 80% similar to the story map we started with. But then we went from story maps to discovery trees. And so we would track our work by discovery trees, both in terms of the questions we had to ask, the things that were left doing, and what we had yet to do. And we would create the preliminary version of the discovery trees, and then we would augment them or sometimes add stuff to like the solo work or another thing. It's like, oh, we got to worry about this. It's not germane to what we're doing. Let's put it over here in another discovery tree. So that's the way we both visually tracked our work, but also we planned our work out and did a little bit of design. And I would say, what do you think? Did we spend, 95% of our time in mostly implementation and research, and 5% discovery trees, or 10%? It was the ratio of design to actual coding was mostly implementation informed by discovery trees, plus research on, like, for example, how do we do this very specific thing with this specific library and get it to integrate with this version of that library? Because we're playing in JavaScript, and a lot of what we were doing was version wars, right? Which combination of versions will produce the least number of warnings or the most working system?
Yeah, I would say discovery trees were a great mechanism for me to get things
Yeah.
out of my head, especially at the end of
Yeah.
the day, right?
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
oftentimes, I live with a stack of 3x5 cards, and I
Mhm.
will leave notes in the pair as we're working along. Sometimes, if it's a big enough thing, I just put it on the discovery tree. When we started let me take a step back. When we started a new topic we would create a discovery tree, and we'd have a conversation about what we think are the major parts, so
Yep.
that we wouldn't forget those things, right? And then we get into the details, and because it was just one pair, we didn't have to do a lot of coordination with another pair or another mob. So we didn't rely on the discovery tree as a mechanism to coordinate across teams, but we use it as a mechanism of don't forget this.
Right.
And
Right.
and it
And as a
also
result, it allowed us to focus on the thing as opposed to focus on, honestly, it allowed for concentration and less chaos in the brain, which meant we were fully capable of creative thinking and research on the specific thing that, rather than trying to juggle a bunch of things. Yeah.
absolutely. And I feel like for me, once I write it down or get it on the tree, it allows my brain to release it. And then I can go back to focusing on the solo topic. And it also forced conversations between the two of us. It was okay to have duplicates on the tree, and then we
Yep.
would clean them up later. And the other thing is, like, I know that's a deeper conversation that I need to have with Brett of, like, is this the trade-off we want to make? Do we want to add this extra nice to have feature or not? Or maybe we leave it on the tree for a conversation later with the product owner.
Right.
It was a place for a later conversation, and it allowed us to again get back to then working on the one thing and then leaving time for those conversations. So we'd have those conversations maybe first thing in the morning,
Yep.
or the end of the day, or around lunch, so that we didn't interrupt the flow of our work.
Yeah. And also, we also use that as a way to track, like, feedback from our client, right? So we'd have a conversation with him in the morning, and we would often just start capturing nodes for a discovery tree and either add them to an existing one or to a new one or something like that. Yeah. By the way, we did have a question about the language and the technology. You want me to just throw a quick summary?
Yeah,
So yeah, from Joe, thanks a lot. So the base language TypeScript, we React Native Web, Skia for 2D graphics. We used Expo, and even though we were supported both web and mobile, we didn't actually need the native directories because there was nothing unique between iOS, Android, and web. So yeah, TypeScript, Expo, TSLint, Node in the background. So it was really React Native and TypeScript. Yeah. And, this is like the third project in a row where I've done React Native and TypeScript, and the second project where it was React Native and AWS and blah, blah, Lambdas and so on. So
it's interesting that spurred the thought in my mind about the other thing that really surprised me, going back to our first question.
Oh, yeah.
The question about technology. We didn't create anything on the back end until we were 8 weeks in. We focused on what features would deliver the most value. So most of the time you're like, hey, the first thing we need is a login page. And the next thing we need to do, we need to start building infrastructure for a database to save this data. And we didn't touch any of that. We had working something that the user could use, something that could be demoed, something workable for 8 weeks before we even started to worry about the back end. That means that our brains we didn't have to focus on building that infrastructure until it was actually needed. We didn't have a login screen because if you don't have a back end, you didn't need a login screen. We didn't have one until 8.5 weeks.
And by the way, the context for that is much of the technical research was around, can we write a compelling client with, it's usable. And honestly, it looks kind of like a Miro or a Visio. You've got elements you can drag and drop. You can connect things, and those connections, you need to know their links and so on. So that's kind of the general idea. Think of a tool like Visio or some kind of drawing tool, with the idea that the elements are things like network switches or security panels or cameras, and then that's kind of the thing we were doing. Yeah,
because you asked the question of, well, how would the user use this? Well, they can create something. Well, how do they save it? Oh, they can save it via an export. It's not the greatest user experience. It's a one and done, but it's something. It's showing the user what is possible. And surprisingly enough, when we went to do the back end, we did it rather quickly by minimizing the work. Maybe not the best long-term solution, but it works. We use flat files to save all the stuff. We didn't have to build the infrastructure of a database.
But the nice thing is, if you look at our front end has a clear set of events. And so if we want to do event sourcing, we're ready to do it. Even though we're not using any tools to do that, we're ready for event sourcing. And the reason for that is, even though we didn't support collaboration, Mark and I did actually keep in our head the context of what we were doing. So for example, knowing, having a clean set of events, like when things are changing, when things are saving, and so on, so that you can know how to share for collaboration, even though we didn't do it. That was something that we would use to inform our APIs, our internal representations of, our providers, really, the React Native providers. But ultimately, that's where our events are handled. And slowly over time, through cleaning things up, our event model kept getting cleaner and cleaner. So even though we haven't implemented the underlying collaboration, since we've done collaboration in other examples, that's the next feature we'd probably work on, and it wouldn't be more than a couple of days to get the first versions working, I think.
And I think it leads to the fact of the importance of having conversations with the product owner and having discussions on the trade-offs, but also making sure as you develop it, don't develop all those features, but develop the code that you need right now with the future in mind, right? We weren't necessarily building infrastructure for collaboration, but we knew the collaboration would be needed in the future. So we're building towards that. We're making it more easily an option in the future. And that all comes down to trade-offs. Everything's a trade-off, especially important with a startup. So having those conversations early, spending that time to have the conversation, so important.
I want to say, though, that just because we were keeping it into consideration, I can think of a number of cases where we said, well, this is going to make collaboration a little more difficult, but it's an okay intermediate step, and we'll get to something a little bit later that's even better. So that's another thing. We weren't, even though we were taking the context into consideration, we weren't actively coding for it until it was necessary. Yeah.
All right. Well, it looks like we're at the end of time here. Half an hour in. Again, if you have any questions, please reach out to us on LinkedIn. We love to continue to have this conversation with you. I'm sure we didn't just scratch the surface of this project, but we'd love to hear from you. And looking forward to working with some other future clients.
Yeah. Now I want to have one closing statement, because this is something that comes up a lot. Now, I don't have any numbers to justify this, but my intuition, given the 10 weeks, I am 100% certain that I could not have done half the amount of work by myself in the first 10 weeks. And I think we had this conversation a number of times. There are a number of times where I would get stuck and you would come up with an idea, or you would get stuck and I would come up with an idea. You actually understood a lot of the ideas I came up with better than I understood it myself. I mean, that was a recurring thing. And I think that happened in both directions.
Yes.
I would say we were easily 5 to 10 times more productive working together easily. I mean, that's a safe number, working together, because I know that I could not have gotten this far by myself in twice the time. There's no way if we had made the time equivalent, I would have got this done by myself. So,
pairing and mobbing is a multiplier.
Yeah. And that's part of our ways of working. So yeah. And again, contact us here. You can connect with both Mark and I at industriallogic.com or LinkedIn, or even if you comment on YouTube, we'll be there as well. So have a great afternoon, everybody, or evening or morning, depending on when you're watching this.
We'll see you.
Yep. Bye, all.